Okay, well, good evening, everybody. Hi, I'm Ken from ADHD Ireland. I'm joined by Hannah, Nicola, Terry, and Tricia. We're very grateful that you took the time to come along today, and it was a very nice, pleasant day here today. Got up to all of 15 degrees in Dublin. And we're delighted that Melissa Orlov has joined us for this webinar. And Melissa is a leading expert in how ADHD affects families and an award-winning author. She's been writing and speaking about the topic since 2007 and began researching it in 2005. Melissa has blogged for Psychology Today and guest writes for many others. She wrote the Your Relationships column for the ADDitude Magazine from 2008 to 2014. Melissa has been frequently interviewed on the topic of marriage and ADHD by organizations such as the New York Times, CNN, and the American Psychological Association. Melissa is a graduate of Harvard College and the Philip Exeter Academy. Her hobbies include road biking, singing, and playing cello. Not sure we'll get any of those today, but you never know. Melissa and her husband of 26 years live in Arizona. Melissa was telling her, I was emailing her, but occasionally gets up to 45 degrees during the summer in Arizona. So we think it gets hot, nothing compared to what they get there. And Melissa says, don't mind if you see the odd cat running across the couch during the middle of the presentation. So with that, thank you very much, Melissa. We'll hand over to you. Just before we do that, just let people know, Melissa will do a presentation. If you have any questions, pop them into the Q&A rather than the chat. We can't pick them out of the chat and put them into the Q&A for some unknown reason. So if you have a question, pop them into the Q&A, and when Melissa's finished her presentation, we will ask her the questions for you. We're also using live transcription. As you can probably see, my words going across the bottom. If you like it, use it. If you don't, you can turn it off. It's just a little button down the bottom. Some people find it useful, some don't. Hopefully all going well. We should have everybody out here by about 8:30. And we will run a little poll towards the end of it just to get your views on how the presentation went. So with all that, thank you very much. Hope you enjoy the webinar. And my pleasure to introduce to you, Melissa Orlov, Nee Connolly.
Yeah, exactly. That came up earlier.
Indeed.
Thank you all so much. I'm delighted to be here. And I have to tell you that I think I need to update my bio because my husband and I have been married now for more than 30 years. So we're still going strong. That's the good news. Let me go ahead and share my screen and put up my presentation here. I need to turn this into a slideshow for everybody. Okay, there we go. So I wanted to talk this evening, I'm delighted to be here. I wanted to talk this evening about building resilience in families with ADHD and talk about some of the issues that the kids face and some of the things that parents can do to help support their kids with ADHD. ADHD is heritable, as most of you may know. So if you have a child with ADHD, you may very well also have at least one adult in the relationship that has ADHD. And that is actually the area where I spend most of my time, my professional time, is in working with adults and couples impacted by ADHD. But I do, in that work, get a certain amount of experience with the family side of it, as well as we have one child with ADHD, one child without ADHD. So we've lived that experience as well. One of the things that about ADHD is not only is it heritable and often multi-generational, but also it can add a lot of stress to a family, particularly between the adults. So adult ADHD often goes undiagnosed for a long time. And when you get into a couple's relationship without knowing that the ADHD is there, there are many things that happen, many patterns that the ADHD and also responses to the ADHD bring into the adult relationship, and then that impacts everybody in the family, including the kids. You're probably familiar that kids often struggle in school if they have ADHD because of the executive function issues, the distractibility, sometimes the hyperactivity, so difficulty staying focused, difficulty tuned in, difficulty organizing information. These things have to do with how the brain matures, which is typically more slowly than neurotypical kids, about 3 years of a delay. So if you have a 9-year-old with ADHD, the logical thinking part of that brain is at about a 6 to 7 year old maturation. So you look at your 9-year-old or your 12-year-old, you expect age appropriate behavior, and yet the logical thinking part of that brain hasn't developed to be at that age appropriate behavior stage yet. So a lot of things that are going on for these kids. One of the characteristics of ADHD that definitely impacts parenting is that people with ADHD often live in what Ned Hallowell likes to call the now or not now time zones, sort of just 2 time zones. Either it's in the now, the present moment, it's very interesting, you can focus on that, or it's in the not now, past or future, which is something I don't have to focus on now. So one man with ADHD described how this feels to him as saying, this is kind of like looking through a paper towel roll, the inside core of a paper towel, where you can see exactly what's through the paper towel thing, but you can't see anything else. And so that has a lot of implications in terms of learning from your mistakes. If you are very in the moment focused, you tend not to remember that thing that maybe you did a previous time and had a bad outcome from, to take that lesson forward. And that's particularly true for kids. And this has implications actually in terms of how you support and raise kids with ADHD. This idea of, well, you'll learn from the consequences, or I'm going to create consequences, may not be as effective for kids who have ADHD. There are other things to be thinking about as well. Some short-term memory issues, impulsivity, which can be a part of ADHD. And then also this idea of having a reward-focused brain. That's an easy way to think about what's going on with some of the neurochemistry with ADHD. ADHD has to do with levels of neurochemicals in the brain, specifically low dopamine. And low dopamine, and it has other things as well, but low dopamine is related to the reward system in the brain. And so what happens is that people who have ADHD have a brain that seeks reward. It seeks things that are interesting or stimulating, things to really hone in on for brief periods of time, lots of times. But if you think of it as a reward-focused brain, that means the thing that feels most rewarding in the present moment, in the now, is the thing that that person is drawn towards. And so thinking about the consequences of something in the future, or something that feels bad right now, like studying for a test, as one example, isn't as motivating as, wow, I'd really like to go watch this video game or go have fun with my friends or whatever it is. So some of the behaviors that you might be seeing in both the children and the adults, if there are those in the family that have ADHD, have to do with brain wiring. It's not about attitude. It's not about willpower necessarily. It is often about wiring. That doesn't mean you can't do anything about it, but it does mean that you need to take the tendencies that those folks have into account as you think about what to do. There are also issues around development of shame in people with ADHD. I see a lot of this with the adults that I work with, because they've had a long history of people that they cared about commenting on what turn out to be ADHD symptoms. And some of these people are trying to be very helpful. It's the classic is the teacher who says, if Jimmy would just try harder, he would do so well. And of course, Jimmy already knows that he's trying really hard, and the ADHD symptoms are getting in the way. But it's hard for him to say, oh, but I'm already trying really hard, because people don't believe him, because the ADHD symptoms make it look as if he's not. Kids with ADHD can face some really difficult times. Sometimes that has to do with social awkwardness, having difficulty reading the emotional cues of others, or understanding what the emotionally appropriate or socially appropriate responses are. Again, I talked about the logical thinking part of the brain developing later. And there are, in like high school, one of the things, at least in the US, is that there's enough awareness of ADD as distracted or hyperactive or whatever, that it has moved into the lexicon in comments like somebody does something that's sort of silly or wasn't well thought out, and the other kids will say something like, oh, that's so ADD. And what they don't realize is what a put down that is to the people who actually do have ADHD, and how difficult that can be. There are also a lot of these lessons that kids with ADHD have from teachers who are trying to get them to calm down versus their peers, which is an interesting area. My daughter, who has the ADHD, who's now 30, has had throughout her life different periods of time when she has really grieved the idea that it's really hard for her to do some things that are easier, much easier for her peers. And at other times, she also is able to recognize the things that she does really, really well. And there are many of those. But this idea, particularly when kids are younger, that it's really, really, I see that this thing, getting the paper turned in, or reading this chapter, or staying on task, or sitting still and pleasing the teacher, or whatever the thing is that they're comparing themselves to others with, is a lot easier for others. And then the parents, in well-meaning ways, but can reinforce some of the issues. And I'll talk a little bit later about ways not to do that. But if you are saying, essentially, you've disappointed me, or you're not doing well enough, or you ought to be able to do better, anytime I hear the word ought to or should, I want to look particularly closely at that statement to see whether or not the ADHD symptomatic issues are being taken into account, because typically a better way to address those kinds of things is to take a look at what's going on, think about what you'd prefer to have happen, and figure out what the strategies would be to get a child or an adult with ADHD into that other place, if possible. So there's a real uphill battle that we don't talk about a whole lot, but we should be talking about. And that's also partially social, not just in terms of expectations of keeping your bottom in a chair if you are a student or whatever, but we actually have a society that is pretty biased, and this may be worse in the US than in Ireland, I'm not sure, but pretty biased towards efficient planning and organizing, right? You think about our really high density information thrown at you all the time. You have to make choices between what it is you're going to do and what you're going to put off, and prioritize things. The people who are efficient planners and organizers are at an advantage in that environment. And one of the things about ADHD is a lot of people describe their ADHD brains as very energetic, very fast, zinging around from thing to thing, and not particularly hierarchical. So it makes it harder to be an efficient planner and an organizer. It's one of the areas where people with ADHD struggle. The information synthesis, some people do this really well, some people don't do it so well, but if you move into a sense of overwhelm, too much stuff, can't handle this now, your protective strategy would potentially be to escape, or to sort of push it away, or put it into the not now. That's problematic. Fast readers are an advantage, and yet many people who have ADHD actually have also got simultaneously sort of what I think of as eye distraction. People with ADHD often have trouble reading quickly. That's not everybody, but many. So that's an issue. That has to do, actually, some people with ADHD actually have an eye tracking disorder that certain optometrists can take a look at and give you some exercises for. But if it's your eye is skipping around the page, and so you have to keep bringing it back to the same place that you were starting with. And there are tasks, if you happen to have that in your family, one way to help address that is simply to use a ruler or a piece of paper or something so that your eye stays above it as you're reading, and that helps direct and focus the eye on where it needs to be. That's just a little aside. But anyway, back to my idea of what the world favors. Verbally audacious with well-organized thoughts. Obviously, there are some issues there for some folks. People who are good at writing, which is another organizational issue for many people. And then emotional stability and emotional and logical maturity. I haven't talked about it yet, but one of the core characteristics of ADHD is emotional dysregulation. And this is something that's being studied relatively recently. In the last 5 or 10 years, there's been much more focus put on the idea of emotional dysregulation and ADHD. And research that was done in 2014 suggests that it is in fact a core characteristic of ADHD to have difficulties managing your emotions. I was at the CHAD International Conference in 2019, and one of the keynote speakers from the University of Pennsylvania was talking about this very thing. And how he described it was the ADHD brain makes a whole lot of emotions, like a ton of emotions, and has very poor brakes on those emotions. So you feel them in a big way, you feel lots of them, you feel them quickly, and the braking mechanism is not so great. So they tend to come out, or they tend to sort of take over. And so that also is not necessarily valued in today's world. So, and when you're in a classroom where emotional outbursts or very strong emotions, positive or negative, can be disruptive, that can be a difficulty. So the bottom line of all of this setup, I hope I'm not painting too bleak a picture, is simply that your child is going to face a lot of pressure, and a lot of pressure that is sort of negative about that child and how he or she might feel about themselves. So parents do well to not add to it. There was an interesting, very small study, extremely small study of middle schoolers with ADHD done a while back now. And it was talking with those middle schoolers about their feelings about home. And one of the things that came out very clearly from these kids was that home was their safe space, that life was out in the real world was fraught with emotional and logistical difficulties for them. And that that the thing that they valued most about being at home was that they could sort of let down, be themselves, not worry so much about the sort of constant critique that they felt they were going through in the rest of the world. So one of the things that ADHD does is it does put a lot of stress on the family. And so I like to talk about how to encourage resiliency within the family, even though that stress is there. So the discipline is different for kids with ADHD. And some of these things I've talked about, late to mature, the symptoms interfering with performance, right? So you might say, look, you need to do it this way, or I would really like to see this kind of behavior. And yet, if you're an emotionally dysregulated kid, suddenly calming your brain down or calming yourself emotionally so that you can take on that task is very difficult. Also, if you have difficulty planning or understanding what the steps are that take you from point A to point B, you don't just suddenly come up with that and suddenly do it because your parent asked you to do it, no matter how much you would like to. Right? I mean, kids with ADHD are some of the hardest working kids you can come across, I think. What I've observed when I look at them is they're working really, really hard to keep their brains going in the direction they want to go in. And it's a real struggle. Lots of times a struggle that's invisible to their parents, unless the frustration comes through and they sort of emotionally melt down. Excuse me. There are some sometimes short-term working memory issues for people who have ADHD. And so there may be memory issues for remembering things in that now, in the past, whatever. And again, all these other things. So these things interfere with how you might think of a standard sort of discipline. And you need some kind of vision of where you want to get to, and you want to have the kid hopefully share this idea of like, okay, what we're looking for here is the basic ideas: respectful behavior towards others, and the ability to engage with tasks in a timely way, or whatever the 2 or 3 things are that you're looking for. One of the things that is unexpected sometimes for parents, and that they have to learn, is that people with ADHD, this is adults and children with ADHD, tend not to go from point A to point B in a straight line. They do what I call the bumblebee approach, right? I love the bumblebee approach. This is one of my daughter's great superpowers, actually. It didn't help her when she was trying to write a paper in college and she had to stay on task, but she's an explorer. Right? She goes from point A to point B in a whole bunch of different, something is interesting, she follows it. Oh, that's an interesting element of this, I'll follow that. And the journey is as interesting as the outcome. And that's amazing. I mean, that's what explorers do, right? And that's what she is. She's an amazing explorer. And the result is she knows a ton about a lot of stuff because she follows it up on that stuff. But if you're in a world where efficient, point A to point B in a straight line is either expected or necessary, that journey, the bumblebee path, can be a disadvantage. So you really have to work with your kids to understand, when does bumblebee work and when do they have to sort of stay within the lines, and to differentiate. It's not about always staying in the lines. It's not about always going in a straight line. It's about being able to discern when it's necessary for your benefit to stay in the straight line, and when you can do the thing that comes more naturally to you. So following a person's strengths to be able to sort of help them identify and glom onto that idea, and also do things that they're really proud of, where they can have a sense of themselves or whatever, is an important part of resiliency in general, and in particular with ADHD. If we look at that explorer as one example, my daughter, the explorer, if my objective is to have her be just like me, and I'm one of those point A to point B people, I would be disappointed, right? It's a strength for her that she knows all this stuff. In one of her first jobs, she was designing children's books and helping with the editing of children's books. And she became the company fact checker, because she knew so many different facts about so many things, because she does this explore thing. I mean, she knows when somebody writes that fish blow bubbles, as an example, that's not actually accurate. I wouldn't, if I read that, I wouldn't think anything about it, not because it's accurate or inaccurate. It's just that I've never come across it where she has, right? So finding what those strengths are and identifying and thinking about them is an interesting part of building resiliency and strength, and reinforcing the strengths of your child. So what does a parent do in this situation, this challenging situation for their kids? First and foremost, I think in an age appropriate way, you help your kids understand ADHD. And there is a difference between the person, the child, the person with the ADHD, and the things that surround them that have to do with the ADHD. It's not a personal failing. This child is not lazy. They're not a bad kid. They're not, they're not when you say bad, that's a very judgmental thing. It's about, here's the kid, and the ADHD is a way that your brain works. It's physiological. It's just part of your genetic makeup. We get what we get. It can be wonderful, and it can also be a pain. And a lot of it depends, as I've been talking about, on which situation you put yourself into in terms of what that is. So this strong idea that you are not your symptoms But if the symptoms get in your way, we can tackle them, right? That is a wonderful, healthy approach. And it isn't we can tackle them as in the parent does everything for the child. If you do that and you do that for a long time, you'll have a more organized household. But when your child leaves the household, you'll also have a child who has been too dependent on you and hasn't learned to be independent and able to manage the ADHD on their own. So it's not about you tackling the problems for the child. It's you and the child conversing back and forth about what works for the child, where are the strengths, how do you figure out, example, child has trouble getting out of bed in the morning. Okay, so what's getting, how come? Well, I'm just too tired, or I don't want to, or whatever it is. You do some exploration of what the options are, and you might come up with an idea, which is, hey, let's put your alarm clock across on the other side of the room, so that you actually physically have to get up out of bed to turn off the alarm, and you can't just roll over. And you try it out, right? That's tackling it together. Another example of tackling it together, you have a child who's supposed to write papers, but gets all bogged down in trying to get it organized. And so you think about, so let's figure out how could we do this in a way that's different? And one of the strategies could be you use note cards, one idea at a time on each note card. You put all the note cards on a table, and then you physically move the note cards around to organize them into groups of thoughts. And that then becomes a structure for your paper, right? So you externalize the organizational structure for the kid. That's tackling them. You come up with things that you experiment with. There are lots of resources that you can find with ideas like the ones I just gave you. It's not, okay, let me organize you. Let me tell you how that paper should be organized or whatever. So these things are tools. Now, one of the things to remember, and it's frustrating for parents, both because we're older and we have a lot more years under our belts, but also because of this logical thinking, slow development. And also, I don't have ADD. So for me, you ought to be able to go from point A to point B pretty easily, and it's not the way it works. For people with ADHD, both children and adults, the amount of effort that you put into something does not equal, always can, but it doesn't always equal the outcome. This is a really, really important thing for people who don't have ADHD to understand about ADHD. So for me, there's a pretty direct correlation between amount of effort expended and the outcome. A little bit of effort, not such a great outcome. Lots of effort, better outcome, right? And it's pretty well correlated. If you have ADHD, that's not the case. If you have ADHD, you can put in a lot of effort and have a decent outcome, or a little bit of effort, excuse me. You can also put in a lot of effort, and sometimes you'll have a great outcome, and sometimes an ADHD symptom is going to get in the way, and you don't have a very good outcome. And you can't predict when that's going to be. It's a very shaky ground to be on. If you understand that, you can be much more empathetic to the inconsistency of the performance of the person with the ADHD. And that's an important part of helping a kid with ADHD. Now, there's a woman named Sharon Saline, Dr. Sharon Saline, who has written an interesting book called What Your ADHD Child Wishes You Knew, about what it's like, about what it's like to have ADHD, and also how to help as a parent. And so these are the 5 C's that she talks about in terms of thinking about parenting kids with ADHD, and I think they're very appropriate. First of all, self-control. So remember, this is genetic. And so you may have a parent who has emotional dysregulation, or who is frustrated, or who doesn't really understand this developmental delay that children with ADHD have. And so the feelings may get out of control. So the very first thing for a parent to do is to manage their own feelings, and then approach the child in a calm, you can do it in a calmer way. If you have 2 emotionally dysregulated people, as you can imagine, the interactions aren't really great learning experiences, and in fact can really damage the relationship between both people. Compassion, meeting the kid where they are, not where you expect them to be, isn't just about being kind to your partner. It's actually a smart way to deal with the fact that there is this logical thinking developmental issue going on. And this becomes particularly important when your kid is in their teens, in their late teens. And in the US, you can get your driver's permit at age 16 in most cases, or right around there. And so you have a 16-year-old who's all their friends are getting their learner's permits, they're all learning how to drive. And your 16-year-old has the logical thinking and self-control of a 13-year-old, which is a big difference. It's a little scary, right? And so because the stakes are high when you're driving a car, you might be particularly anxious about making sure everything is just right. You still have to be thoughtful about, okay, so what do we do with that? Maybe you wait for a year, and some people do that. Our daughter was actually off at school and she had to wait for a year because she wasn't able to be near us in our car, which was terrific, even though she was quite mature because for other reasons. So, but still, these issues are there to be thinking about. So compassion is great. Collaboration. So I just gave you some examples of collaboration, right? And the reason you don't want to be imposing solutions is that that straight line set of solutions doesn't tend to work for people who have ADHD. It doesn't feel natural to them, and they can't really twist themselves in a pretzel to make it feel comfortable. I tend to think, both because of my position as sort of the, if you want to call it, lead parent in our family, as our kids were growing up, and also just because my ego is such, I used to think, oh, well, this is a good way to do it. I know this is a good way to do it. But for my child with ADHD, not so much. I had to learn that her way of doing it might look completely different. I have lots of examples of this with couples and with adults with ADHD. There's a woman, for example, who told me that the way that she gets her kitchen cleaned is that she sets a timer, a kitchen timer, for 10 minutes, and then she races the timer. Now, I don't need to do that. And if I were thinking about how to help somebody learn how to do the kitchen, clean up the kitchen, that isn't what I would first come to mind. But it works great for her because she really likes the game of doing the race with the timer. I have another person who keeps her clean laundry after she's cleaned it in the laundry basket in her laundry room rather than folding it and putting it away. She has zero interest in folding it and putting it away, but she does need to be able to find her clean laundry, and that's a system that works for her. So there are lots of solutions that will work for a person who has ADHD that may not be the first things that come to your mind. So don't impose your solutions. Think creatively. Think series of informed experiments. There are lots of things that we know work for ADHD, strategies, gamifying something, making it reward focused, reward centered so that it deals with that reward focused brain, those kinds of things, maybe writing things down to remember, creating some structures. You don't have to start from scratch. You can use other people's ideas. Like, I'll be delighted if you help your kids put notes on note cards and organize their papers that way. But finding interesting solutions and solutions that are tailored to the strengths of your child is really what you're doing. And again, not taking over. Consistency. Do your best to nurture the child's efforts. You don't need to be perfect, and certainly your child doesn't need to be perfect. That's part of growing up, is finding out that you're not perfect. So that goal is usually good enough. Like, I'm looking to make things good enough. And then celebrating the successes, right? Again, not just with kids, but also with all of the people in your family. Sometimes if you're frustrated or if your child is melting down, it's pretty hard to celebrate the successes. But if your child has melted down and then you have in place some kind of way that the child is learning to self-soothe, to calm themselves down after they've had the meltdown, and they actually do that, celebrate the fact that they succeeded at the self-soothing rather than focusing on the negative that they had the meltdown in the first place. So if you have a reward-focused brain, you are much more motivated by the positive than you are by the negative. Consequences, negative consequences, or as we say, it's the carrot or the stick. Sticks here don't work with kids with ADHD. Celebration does. Also, expect the unexpected and have that be a celebration as well. You will get a lot of the unexpected. And so one of the ways to have a resilient family is to have flexible parents when it comes to what's coming your way. So I'll give you some examples from our own lives as my daughter was growing up. When she was in middle school in 6th or 7th grade, I would ask her, do you have homework today? And she's 11 or 12 at this point, right? So she's pretty old, and she'd say, I think so. And I'd say, well, okay, so did the teacher write anything on the board? And she'd say, I think so. I'd be like, okay, so you think you have homework, but you have no idea what it is. So why don't you call one of your friends and get your homework? And she's like, oh, I'm kind of embarrassed to do that. I'm like, well, okay, but you still need to know what your homework was. So, not judgmental, but just problem, like, okay, the problem is you were distracted. That's the ADHD, you were distracted, you didn't write it down. And then hopefully, if she does that a few times and she's embarrassed to call her friends, she'll start to create a system for herself to figure out how to get that homework written down. We had a lot of times when my child would do something for homework and then leave it at home because they forgot the rest of the assignment is to put it back into your backpack so you can get it back to school, right? So I left whatever it was at home. If it was highly critical, sometimes I would give her a backstop and take it to school for her so she could get it. Lots of times I wouldn't. But what that did then is they, if you're working as a team, the next thing is, gee, I noticed you're doing this quite a bit. Maybe there's a system we can put in place, like a list or something where you check it off. You do each thing on the list before you're done with your homework. And the last thing is put your homework in your backpack or whatever that is. We had a funny experience one time. I was coming back. My daughter used to play in the band. And when she was in, I don't know, 4th grade, something like that, we were driving home and suddenly it's like, stop the car, And she was really quite in distress. And I sort of looked back and she had a lizard attached to this part of her hand. And she was doing this and the lizard is shaking around and going back and forth. It turned out that during band practice, she had picked up a lizard because of course she's my little explorer, not little anymore, but she was then little. She had picked up this lizard and put it in the pocket of her sweatshirt. And then forgotten about it, gone to band practice. The lizard was perfectly happy. It was nice and warm, I guess. But anyway, when we got in the car and the lizard was still in there, she put her hand into the pocket and then he bit her and hung on. Hilarious, though, also surprising, right? And you have a choice as a parent. You can go like, what were you thinking? Why'd you put a lizard in your pocket of your sweatshirt? Or you can say, okay, so let's figure out how to get the lizard off your hand and make sure that everything's okay and make sure, the wound is attended to appropriately and not worry about it, because that's just what happens. You get the unexpected, and flexible is good. You get a lot of things like, can I have a ride to rowing practice? This is in high school, immediately because I forgot to say anything. And again, at that point, you say yes, of course, if you can. And then you say, let's figure out what the system is so that there are fewer surprises. And you work together to figure out that system. Sometimes you'll get, I really can't do this, the sort of hopelessness or the whatever. And the way not to respond to that is to say, of course you can. Right? Your child has just told you, I don't think I can do this. And if you override their feelings, or what it's called in the counseling world is invalidate their feelings. You're saying that they are wrong, that you're not listening to them, and that your opinion is more important, right? So we think of ourselves as saying, of course you can do that, as being encouraging, but what the child hears or the other adult hears, if they're being invalidated, is this person is not listening to me, and they don't believe me, and they don't value me. Right. So rather than responding to I can't do this, or a point of view that you think maybe isn't completely based in reality, by correcting that statement, the way to respond to it is essentially with affirmation. I hear you saying you can't do that. Can you explain more about why? Maybe we can address this together. Maybe we can, figure this out. And delve into it with the person. In other words, respect their opinion and go in for it. And then you may get failing grades. This is not that uncommon with kids with ADHD. They fall behind in something that's sequential, or they're too distracted or whatever. And particularly if this is when they're young, it's an opportunity to say, maybe we need to be managing the ADHD, or you need to be managing the ADHD better. Let's work on that. Let's see if we can get the right kind of support, et cetera. There are, at least in the US, there are coaches that work with kids. You can get school resources, et cetera. I'm not as familiar with Ireland, but there are ways to get some support. You also want to make sure that you can embrace the strengths. ADHD does not prevent a child from being exceptional. What it does is it makes it harder to go from point A to point B in a straight line, or to stay on task or whatever. But that does not mean that your child doesn't have a superpower. Most kids do. You just have to figure out where it is. So the fact that they're not behaving the way that you think they're behaving is not an indication that they can't succeed. It's an indication that they have the symptoms of ADHD, or emotional dysregulation that comes with ADHD. And the same thing with having trouble staying organized. It doesn't mean that here I say partner without thinking about it, because I work with couples so much, that your child is dumb or lazy. This is what Ned Hallowell calls the moral diagnosis of ADHD. That's not what's going on. Play is really important in terms of locating your strengths, whether you're an adult or a child with ADHD. Pay attention to play. And in fact, there's a real role for that. Ned Hallowell wrote a really interesting book called The Childhood Roots of Adult Happiness. And it's about play in the largest sense of the word, getting into flow with something where you're really engrossed with it, as a way to develop expertise and self-confidence. Play also has a different role for kids with ADHD, and that is that it is a known treatment for helping manage both the symptoms of ADHD, specifically focus, as well as emotional regulation. So exercise is critical. Make sure before your kid sits down to do their homework, for example, if there's an opportunity to get out and run around, they should, because that physical activity focuses the brain for about 3 hours. So exercise can be used very tactically to improve focus. It's also a part of good health, right? And just remember, and I've said this before, that usually kids with ADHD are trying really, really hard to deal with whatever the issues are that they're dealing with. So if you remember that, it helps. Ned Hallowell likes to talk about the mirror traits of ADHD, things that can be described in two different ways. Distractibility, for example, can be described as curiosity, right? I'm really distracted by something. This is a little bit like the bumblebee approach, or my daughter, the explorer, right? She's really curious about stuff. She loves exploring nature and the world around her. She loves exploring art projects and things that are creative. So there are a lot of these things. I'm not going to go through each of them, but you get the idea. Think about trying to position your thinking about those people in your family who have ADHD on the positive side. it's just a lot better place for those people to rest. And it's not untrue. So there's when you can see the positive side and appreciate the positive side, it's also easier to hold that positioning of, well, look, ADHD can be very positive, and then there are these things that are kind of like not so much fun. Ned Hallowell did a hilarious video, or I shouldn't say it's hilarious, but a very fun video of what it's like for him to have ADHD. And he was talking about that particular day that he was making the recording. He said, I sat down to breakfast and I proceeded to pour my coffee into my grapefruit juice glass. He said, of course, can't drink it that way. And that's what it's like. He wasn't paying attention. He has ADHD. He's often not paying attention. He said, so the solution for that is to move my coffee cup away from my grapefruit juice cup further. And I know, by the way, Ned's going to be speaking for ADHD Ireland coming up. He's great. So I recommend that you listen to him. And then he had later in the same day, he said he went to the pharmacy and then he had to go home again because he had left his wallet at home. I mean, things like that. It's not that he's a bad person. It's just that these are part of his ADHD. He's very distractible. And he's learned, okay, I can accept that. Now what? Well, okay, I got to go home, get the thing, and then I come back. That's just sort of part of his life. He can beat himself up, or he can figure out how to live with it and focus in on his strengths. And that's what he's done. And that's what I hope you'll help your kids do as well. I also think it's a really, really important idea to be open about ADHD early on, at an age-appropriate way, and in a very positive, strengths-based, you are going to do things differently. That's perfectly fine. It's a different way of being in the world, and honoring that way of being in the world by trying to utilize it to the positive is great. Everybody has different strengths and weaknesses. This was a huge theme in our family because, as it turns out, my son and my husband have a lot of the same characteristics in terms of their sort of logical approaches to things. And my daughter and I are more in the emotional realm. We're more creative, et cetera. That doesn't have to do anything to do with ADHD or non-ADHD, because my husband also has ADHD. It's just everybody has different strengths and weaknesses. And you can look in your family and use other family members and say, this person has this strength, this person has this strength. Not everybody has to be the same. We get what we get. Some of it we get from our genes. So that you just get what you get. It isn't like you had any choice in it. And treatment for ADHD should not be a taboo subject or a difficult one, or I hope it's not, because there's a lot of evidence that it can help with self-esteem and help improve things. But you have to be very careful about how you talk about it. Particularly about medication, because if your approach is something that implies that you think that this child needs to be fixed and the medication is going to fix the child, that is not a message you want to send, because what the child hears is, I am broken. You do not want your child to think that you think they're broken. And I would encourage you, if you do think that, I would encourage you to do some reflection, some journaling or something else, so that you can really confront that attitude. Your child may be immature for their age. They may struggle with things that you don't struggle with, but that does not mean they're broken. It means that you have to work harder to figure out where those gifts and strengths are. You can get help from coaches, from others. Try to distribute who the child is interacting with in terms of very positive people who understand ADHD. In the States, you can get family coaching. I'm assuming you can there as well. And medication can help. I've watched one of my daughter's friends go from being a D student, which isn't very good, to being a B student, which is pretty good. Simply by changing how well she was able to focus in the classroom because she started taking medication. And this was in high school. She was a junior in high school when she finally did this. And it was a pretty fast shift. Medication doesn't help everybody, but it can help kids gain their footing and stay focused enough to learn how to manage their ADHD more broadly. Make sure the child is involved in what the treatment looks like. We had wonderful advice from an expert on this when our daughter got diagnosed at age 9. He said, talk with her about her options and then make her part of the decision. She's in charge. It's her body. That was interesting to hear as a parent who was used to thinking of like, no, I know, and the child is just learning from me. And so we talked with her about the ADHD and about what it felt like for her and where the hardships came for her and where her strengths were and what the different options were for treating, including medication, all that. And then she waited for 2 years. She knew about that. She waited for 2 years and finally school got harder and she was starting to fall behind. And she said, I think I'm ready to try that because things are becoming pretty difficult for me. And it would be interesting to see if anything would happen. So it was very appropriate from the standpoint of this wasn't going to change her life. She didn't think she was broken. It was a tool for her. And as it turned out, it helped her and that was great. But the fact that she was in charge of that decision was important for her understanding what the medication was for. It wasn't for changing her or fixing her. It was so she could focus better in school. And that was a really important thing for her to understand. I talked about invalidation. The opposite of invalidation is validation. And what you'll end up having is there will be anger, there will be blow-ups, there will be confusion, there will be feelings that you don't understand, there will be self-doubt. Validate those feelings, not as in, I agree, you're not as good as others. That's not validation, but I hear what you're saying. I hear your opinion. I hear you're concerned about this, or I see that you're angry and I want to talk with you about it. I want to understand it. I want to hear what's going on for you. Not, you should think this way, or no, you definitely are as good as others. You're better than the others, or whatever. Again, that's invalidation. So listening, learning, asking questions that are non-judgmental, calm tone of voice, accepting, and not negating what's going on for that partner or that child is really important. So the greatest gifts that you can give to a child who has ADHD as a parent are acceptance of the ADHD. This is, everybody's different. Everybody has strengths and weaknesses. So acceptance of that, plus working together, not imposing, but working together on tools that can help get the pesky parts of the ADHD off to the side. You don't have to do all that hard work for the homework and then forget about it and leave it at home. There is a system of some sort that you'll be able to figure out that can get that homework to school so that you can get credit for it. Flexibility, much more maybe than you're used to thinking about as a parent, particularly if you have very traditional ways of thinking about, look, you're a kid, you're going to just pay attention and do what I ask you to do. More flexibility than that, but not so much that the child doesn't have any guardrails. You still do need to have guardrails. For example, always being respectful, right? That isn't, maybe there's no negotiation there. It's a constant how we learn how to be respectful. One of the things that we put up in our with our kids was, you don't have to succeed, but we do want you to try. That was a very, we used to talk about that a lot. And that was a acknowledgement that success came more easily for one child than for the other. But it's also an acknowledgement of, we want you guys to invest some hard work in trying to do the things you want to try. We want you to make yourselves vulnerable and do that. You want to admire and you want to persevere the courage that your child has when they are in the face of adversity. Kids with ADHD have much more adversity than maybe their parents are aware. Respect of the opinions of the child is important, right? And creating a sense of their own value. And the best way to do that is to make sure that they have an identifiable strength. Our daughter not only has ADHD, actually the way we found out about the ADHD was that she had a math learning disability, which became obvious pretty early on. She was really struggling with math. No matter how hard she tried, she was having trouble doing her calculations when she was young. So we finally said, this just doesn't feel right. There's a lot of effort and no outcome here. We took her in for the evaluation. And it turns out that she has a very severe, very narrow learning disability called dyscalculia, which is around whether or not you can add, subtract, multiply, or divide. It is a wonderful learning disability to have because the solution for it is you use a calculator and it's gone, right? I mean, or at least the problem is solved. But in elementary school, her peers who are not things to her like, what's wrong with you? How come you can't multiply 4 times 5? And we worked with her on what she could say back. And happily, she really genuinely believed this. And it was true. She said to them, my brain doesn't do that very well, but it's really good at being creative. And so she had her superpower. She knew what it was. She was a fabulous artist. She was very creative. She still is. She was a great explorer. She had things that she knew she had confidence in. And so when somebody attacked her on one of her symptoms, in this case, a symptom of the math learning disability, she had a place that she could go to. So like in that research, make yourselves a safe zone. And I hope that this has provided you with a way to think about this. So the last thing I want to talk about, I think this is the last thing, is that the parental interactions in a family impacted by ADHD are also really important. So couples that are impacted by ADHD often struggle more likely than not. If you have ADHD in your family and you have that adult with ADHD, it's more likely than not that your marriage is troubled. And so you get a lot of the anger and the arguments and difficulty communicating and stuff at the parental level, but the parents, the couples are the grounding force. They're the base of the health of the family. So if you're in that situation, seek help. And I'm going to be talking about that, about couples, on June 24th. So you can come hear me do that, or you can come to my website, which I'll give you the information about in a moment. And so there are a lot of patterns that might be showing up in your relationship, and your kids observe these things. So if there are hard feelings about the adult ADHD, you know, this person's not doing their tasks as they should, or they're never on time, or they're consistently inconsistent, or whatever, the kids will pick up on that. So it is important to address the adult issues as well as as trying to help your child. Okay, so I promised some resources. This is this book down in the right-hand corner, What Your ADHD Child Wishes You Knew. So there are a couple of books that I love about parenting kids with ADHD and with other things. The first two here are really terrific. When I read the Parenting ADHD Now book, I said, wow, that's one of the best parenting books I've read, period. Forget about whether ADHD is in on it. So these are, that first one is more if your kids are elementary, maybe up through middle school. And then the Essential Guide to Raising Complex Kids is more slightly older children, middle school up through high school, and et cetera. And then this book I already talked about, and the Hallowell book. There's some parent training through Impact Parents. And then my website for couples and couples resources is ADHDmarriage.com. And I do give seminars that people that are not in the States can partake in, either by listening to recordings that I do weekly when I'm giving them, or in a self-study version, as well as some groups and some other things. And I have people from overseas participate in those as well. So you're invited to do that if you'd like. Okay, so with that, I believe I'm going to unshare, stop sharing, and answer questions. So I'll leave this up for just 1 second more if you need it. And also they have this presentation if you want it. So I'm going to stop sharing. There's my mouse. Okay. And I'm happy to answer questions. Hi, Ken.
Okay. Thanks very much. That was lots of practical help, which was really, really great. And the good news is that there's tons of questions to get through. So we might be here for a little while, yeah, but we'll get through as many as we can. I'll just go with the very first one. So again, just having a look through the questions that come in. Just the second question was, can a young child aged 5 to 6 behave well at school, but be different at home with ADHD?
Well, I suppose so. It could be that there are structures that the child is in at school where there's expectations that the child is meeting. The other thing is that school's happening earlier in the day. And so there may be a time of day when the kid is at a better place. And then later in the day, they're tired. And when you're tired, you don't perform as well. You might be more irritable, et cetera. There may also be a little bit of a power struggle going on, even at the early age. You think tantrums are power struggles about whether that child is, feeling like they're getting what they want from their parents. So I suppose so. You see that more frequently if you've got a kid on medication where the medication wears off just about the same time that the school stops. And then there's what we call the witching hour for kids with medications, where as they come off the medications, they become irritable and a little harder to manage. So that's possible.
Okay. Thanks very much for that. So we'll go through the team. Obviously, we're just behind the scenes. We've been going through the questions and correlating them. So I think Nicola has the next question.
Yeah. Melissa, thanks for that presentation. It was really good. We have a question here from Annie. My son's 11 and has ADHD combined type and also ASD. He has a good understanding of his ADHD and ASD and is quite positive about his differences. But he has two neurotypical siblings, and the mom is worried about her son's relationship with his sister, who is 9. Almost 100% of his interactions with her are negative, and he criticizes her at every possible moment. He's looking at her saying she's the wrong pencil grip, she's sitting the wrong way, she's eating the wrong way, the ball's bouncing too loudly. He can become very frustrated and dysregulated with his own reactions to her. This has been happening for a while and seems to be getting worse. And as parents, we're concerned about the relationship and that the daughter is naturally empathetic and kind to him, but she can't understand why he is working this way with her. He doesn't seem to act like this to the same extent with his younger brother for some reason. And is there anything they can do to help?
So I'm guessing that the 9-year-old is the sibling that's closest in age from how you described that. And there may be a little bit of self-comparison going on where the criticizing of the sibling is a way of trying to make himself feel more in line and more equal to the neurotypical student. I think the way I would handle that is to sit down when he's calm with him and say, hey, I've noticed a lot of this critical behavior, or that you're talking about things about what your sibling is doing that you wouldn't necessarily want someone to talk to you that way. And so I want to understand what's going through your mind, or what are you feeling at that time? Or is there something that just, is it just like it just comes to you or whatever? It sounds like it could be insecurity relative to that sibling. And it may be that child is not able to access what's going on inside of him, in which case I might put up one of these more generalized conceptual goals for the family as a whole of respectful behavior, and talk with him about it in terms of the respectful behavior. Like, okay, you may have some frustration, or you may be feeling bad or whatever, but this isn't really respectful. This is very critical. So we'd like to talk with you about different ways you can express yourself. But the first place I would look, or the first assumption I would make, is that there's competition that hasn't yet really been delved into there, and that he's trying to bring her down to what he perceives to be his level.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks. Just a couple of quick things just before we go to the next question from Hannah. Just going to launch a very quick poll. It'll take you 30 to 10 seconds to fill it out. So we really appreciate your taking time on that. And just to let you know, we are recording this, and once we have it chopped and tailed and ready to go up on YouTube, we'll send it out with the slides so you get all the information as well. So just while Hannah's doing the next question, I'll launch the poll.
Thank you, and thanks, Melissa. That was really informative and great presentation. I see there's a question here from Caroline. You touched on this in the presentation about being very forthright and upfront with children about you know, their ADHD from an early age. But Caroline is asking, what age approximately should we explain to a child that they have ADHD? Her son is about to turn 12 and is about to start secondary school, which is, if they're 12, I guess it's kind of like middle school kind of age. So starting a new school, big school, and turning 12.
Okay. So chances are pretty good that the kid already understands by age 12 that they are a little different from their friends. Could be in a good way, could be that they're doing this comparison and seeing, it's much harder for me to do some things or whatever. I think the answer to that is that you cherish the differences and you talk about how much you love the differences, and that's sort of the first stage. The second stage is you make sure that they are equipped to understand that there's actually a name for this, that there are actually symptoms, that the child and the symptoms are not the same thing. Before they get to a place where their peers are going to tell them this also and start critiquing them, or their teachers. Because at some point, the fact that they have ADHD, unless it's extremely well managed already, is going to show up in gee, this is the kid who never remembers to write down their homework assignment. This is the kid who has to sit in the front of the class because that's how the teacher keeps that child focused, and other kids don't have to do that. This is the kid who, fill in the blanks. And so it can help to have an explanation for that, to understand that it's not a moral failing or something like that. So I would say by the time you get to be 12 and you're about to go into what is essentially one of the most difficult developmental stages for kids, which is this secondary school or middle school age, it's probably about time to start talking about that and take it from the positive. You know that you have all these things that are different about you, that are wonderful about you. And part of the reason you have that is because, as it turns out, actually you have ADHD. I mean, the other time to talk about it, which is obvious, going in to talk to this person about who they are and doing these tests and stuff, that's a great time to talk with a kid and start the conversation with ADHD. And typically the doctor will have talked with them about it as well.
Cool. Well, Grant, thanks for that. Sorry, just the internet connection went there for 10 seconds for me. We're all back online again. Does Trisha have the next question?
Yeah. Yeah, sorry, just bring it up there. It says, how do you reconnect with a 17-year-old girl whose recent diagnosis was and is withdrawn from the family? She's got poor school attendance since she was 13, has a hard time at school, but has become exhausted and withdrawn from everything that the diagnosis, and the diagnosis took so long that she has been through a lot and is angry now with everybody.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things is sympathy and validation and curiosity, if she'll let you in to do it. I mean, this is one of the benefits of doing this at a younger time, if you can, is that they're less likely to be in that angry teenage, I have to be independent from you stage. Also, there's likely to have been less time with the parents saying, well, you should do it this way, you should do it that way, why aren't you at school, whatever those things are. The withdrawing, I would also make sure that there isn't a serious depression going on at the same time. If possible, talking with the kid about the depression or a possibility of it, making sure that they're not a suicide risk in the extreme side of things, and finding out from them, just reiterating how much you love them, validating them in positive ways as much as you can, making sure they understand that you're available for them, that you want to respect their choices, but also that their choices make you sad, that you miss the connection that you used to have, and you would really like to rebuild it whenever they're ready. You cannot force, particularly an angry person, but really anybody, to connect with you. You can't make them do something they don't want to do, but you can always indicate that you are ready for that connection and that you really long for it, and try to ask questions about their experience without inserting your own.
Okay, thanks very much for that.
Sorry, Ken.
No, my fault entirely. Just before we join, I just want to share the result of the poll because it's actually very interesting. Just in terms of, the presentation tonight, what are we looking at? Sort of approximately 96% are finding it very useful and they've taken away lots of stuff. So again, thanks very much for that, Ursula. I do, and I've always thought, we probably get quite a high, more female than males on these audiences. So when restrictions end, the most popular choice was going straight to the hairdresser. I obviously don't have that worry or concern myself. Second was going on a family or all of the above, and then going on a foreign holiday. The interesting part of the survey here then was looking at, do you think your child knows how to support your child with ADHD? 50-50 split on that one, which is quite interesting. However, and then the next one was, do you think you get enough support through the HSE, which is either through primary care or CAMS? 15% yes, 85% no. So I think what we can take out of this, schools are improving, but the HSE is a lot more to do. So that's really, really interesting just from our perspective. Just we go on to the next question. I see Nicola's having internet connections problems down in Port So Terry just down in Wexford has the next question.
Yeah. So
can I just hold on Terry, before you ask it, I just want to make a comment about that. There are some resources in the US because the US is ahead of much of the rest of the world when it comes to providing resources for ADHD. There are some resources that you can use to get support for your family in the US. You have to pay for them; they're not free, but that might be useful. So sorry. Okay, Terry, go ahead.
thanks, Melissa. That was a really interesting presentation, really useful. So anonymous attendee here, from your therapy with families, do you find that kids with ADHD can be aggressive and violent towards their parents and siblings?
Yes. So that's part of the emotional dysregulation. Is that and it's called flooding. It actually has a word, and the adults can do it as well, where you get completely overwhelmed. These emotions are so big, and the break's so small that it can turn into aggression. Once somebody is flooded, biologically what's happening is that all of the blood flow that goes to the logical thinking part of their brain is going back to the fight or flight primitive parts of the brain. And so they actually don't have the blood flow even to think logically. So you cannot logic a child or an adult who's in a flooded state out of it. You have to provide a way for them to calm down and some time and space or whatever that takes, and then address whatever the issue is at a later time. The issue for kids in particular is strengthening the brakes, finding ways through exercises that you might do with them, through working with them, through emotional, extra years, emotional maturity, ways for them to put the brakes on. One way we do this with adults is mindfulness training, where they can learn to start to feel what their body feels like, so that in the lead up to that flooding, sometimes there is some kind of a physical feeling that they can learn to identify and speak out about. So like, I'm starting to feel frustrated, or I'm starting to get out of control, or whatever it is, that they might be able to learn how to express it in a way that those who are like family members who are used to being with them can take the appropriate action, like saying, okay, why don't you go calm down for a while, or why don't you go read a book, or whatever, rather than engaging with them around that thing. That takes a lot of effort and time and practice, but that's the kind of thing you're talking about when you're talking about strengthening the brakes, as well as just getting some additional years in the maturity. Yes, it's definitely an issue, just out of control behavior.
Indeed, thanks very much for that. I think Hannah has the next question.
Yep, I'm going to roll two into one, do two birds, one stone. And an anonymous attendee is asking about your personal experience, Melissa. They're asking if your daughter had inattentive or hyperactive ADD, or a combination, and if meds helped. Then following on from that, An anonymous attendee is asking, did you find that your daughter's relationship with her sister was strained as a child and a teenager? They're saying my non-ADHD daughters sometimes resent that our ADHD son gets his way more often. We try to be fair, but they are different, so we have to treat them differently in certain cases.
Yeah. So the answer is both my daughter and my husband have the inattentive form of ADHD. They managed it completely differently, and it showed up completely differently between the two of them. My daughter did take stimulant medication and still does, and it does help her. She thinks of it as a very specific get it done. She calls it my get it done medication. That's the role it plays for her. It helps her stay focused and get tasks that she otherwise would have trouble sticking with. It helps her stay with those things. And she's, over the years, she has had to address and change both the medication she was taking and also the dosages so that she got coverage when she needed it. And these things do happen as you get older. You may have to change the dosing, or as you take on, for example, athletics, and you are running through the medication faster because your metabolism is working a lot faster because of the athletics. You might have to add a small booster dose or something in the afternoon to get through homework or whatever it is. So her issue, her primary issue is will have the inattentive, not all girls, but many girls will have the inattentive form of ADHD. My husband also has the inattentive form. It showed up completely differently for him. His was procrastination and also what I called spurts of anger, emotional dysregulation, where we'd be talking and something would trigger him and suddenly he was like wild. Very destabilizing for our relationship. He was not able to take a stimulant medication. They didn't agree with him at all. So he actually took an antidepressant called Wellbutrin over here in the States. And he doesn't even need that anymore, but that helped him manage his emotions. So two different, very different signs. In terms of how the siblings get along, I think it's not just about ADHD, it's also about gender and the age differences and personalities of those kids. My daughter is a very gentle, respectful child. She's the older sibling. My kids were 3 years apart, and the second child is actually a boy. So I think that made a difference, but also the age difference, so that they were, pretty far apart. They're good friends, but they understood that they were very different people, in part because of the age difference and other factors as well. So I think you can have rivalry just by the fact that people are siblings, and maybe that comes more frequently with same gender kids. I'm not sure.
Thanks very much. Just I'm going to go to Tricia, but before that, just a question that I thought was quite interesting that came in earlier from Lisa, and you were talking earlier about gamification, but someone was wondering, can gamification be a bad thing if the child always has to win?
Well, I mean, I guess it depends on what you're trying to accomplish. I wasn't thinking about gamification against other people necessarily. I was thinking about gamification as in make the thing really engaging and fun and like a game to motivate yourself. So if the child has to win and the winning is getting the thing done, then it's serving the purpose of motivating, like racing the timers, motivating the woman to be able to clean her kitchen. If you're gamifying it and it's against a bunch of other people, then I think there might be some problems, because there's also the potential for reinforcing the differences in terms of performance, where you have the ADHD symptomatic issues going along. So I was thinking of a game of really as I don't know if that answers the question for that.
No, that's what I understand the difference, but I didn't get the differentiation on the explained there, the difference between making it a game and making it a competition. So that's what I was going on. So thanks very much for that. That's why, for me, more than anything else. So we're going to Tricia for the next question.
Hi, this is an anonymous attendee. If it is important to be open, can Melissa suggest how to help a newly diagnosed 17-year-old who is totally against having ADD to accept it and be open to help tackling his symptoms?
So that's a great question, and it's a very difficult age to get that diagnosis, though you should, if you're, you got to go on and be successful in life, you should, if you think ADHD is an issue, you should go get an evaluation and see. So there is something that goes on anytime a person who is essentially, in this case, an adult, but remember, in this case, an adult who's got the maturity of about 3 years earlier, so like 14. And that, by the way, goes on until about age 25 or 27. That's when things sort of even out. So it takes a while for the catch up there. Anybody who is in that more adult phase, and certainly an adult who gets diagnosed, goes through a process which may be invisible to the other people around them in terms of understanding that diagnosis. And that's one of reevaluation. So they have had a series of experiences around having the symptoms of ADHD, which they've had and dealt with for their entire life, even if they didn't have a name for it. And they've encountered problems with it lots of times. And so now they have a name for it, and there is a grieving process, there's a reevaluation process. They look back at their history and they say, oh, it could have been different if I'd known about it or whatever. There's also, particularly for somebody who's as young as 17, this, I just want you to love me the way I am. I just want to get along in the world the way I am. I don't want people to tell me I need to work hard to change things or fix myself or whatever. You're telling me that I'm broken. A lot of people who get that ADHD diagnosis, particularly if they are resisting it because they believe that what it's saying is that they're broken. So part of that communication is, no, you are definitely not broken. This is a part of understanding how to make yourself be able to get the things you want to get, right? To be able to live the life you want to choose. You're still in control. This is just information for you about how you're going to perform you're optimally. And there are things that will help you perform optimally and get the things you want to get. But nobody's going to be able to force you to take those things or to do those things. We want you to know they're available to you. We hope that you'll experiment with some of them, but you're still in charge. We're not in charge. And that's something that might help. Accepting and validating that those feelings are real and that you can't just wish them away or tell them that they shouldn't feel that way. You do not want to be doing that, particularly with a 17-year-old. You want the opposite. You want to be acknowledging that the feelings are real for them. And then, take it from there, let them lead. But again, we're here for you. We love you a lot. We do not in any way, shape, or form think you're broken. We want you to be able to access the support and the tools that will help you succeed in whatever you choose to do. That's our only goal.
Okay, thanks. And just for that, just a comment came in there from Caroline, probably in relation to the question I was asking. And she says, I bribed my son with a video game to reward him for wearing the mask to school, worked a treat, helping to prevent him from COVID. So there you go, gamification in action. Just before we just go on to Terry for the next question, obviously just, I know to thank Melissa for the talk, but it was Terry's idea to get you here in the first place. So thanks very much, Terry. And if you have the next question, it'd be great.
Yeah, I do. It's from Mags. So is it best not to use consequences at all with a child with ADHD in terms of managing behavior issues?
I think you so obviously that's, it's an extreme example, but it's important for people to learn that there are consequences. I think the thinking pattern that isn't as useful for these kids is if I, as a parent, create a punishment consequence, my child will learn from that punishment what I want them to learn. That's the faulty thinking. If you create a punishment for the child, but they might learn something different than what you want them to learn. Like, gee, isn't my parent really unfair, or or something else? And they might well not hang on to the learning from the experience. So yeah, what I try to do is say, create these guardrails around the things that you really truly care about. Pick 2 or 3 things that are really important. And again, we picked respect. We picked you don't have to succeed. You need to, we want you to try, that kind of thing. And then try not to create a ton of consequences that are artificial or imposed by you along areas that are less important. Like, I'll give you an example. My daughter's room was always really, really messy, which is not all that uncommon. If you have ADD, you sort of drop and go and you're not thinking about it. You don't notice the mess. We did not end up creating a consequence for that, because we ended up just saying, you know what, that's not where we want to have the battle. Okay, just close the door. And at some point, put your dirty laundry in the hamper so we can wash it. So it's picking and choosing what things are really important to reinforce.
Cool. Well, that's obviously, pick your battles is a very important thing to do. And just we're coming up to 8:30, but we probably, we run 5-10 minutes over because we still have loads of questions there. And Hannah has the next one.
Yep, there's one coming through from Eva. This is about presumably an adult in a 51-year-old male, and Eva's asking if someone can be extremely intelligent, have ADHD, they tend not to reach their full potential in school and work, but they have their own business. They feel that they get by, but they're capable of so much more. But all this time is obsessed about a specific topic, example, sports, and it takes over everything.
Yeah, so ADHD and intelligence are not correlated. So you can be really, really smart, like my husband is brilliant, and have ADHD. So there's no correlation there. And being very focused in on the sports, it sounds to me like the sports provide a reward. It might be actually like a dopamine hit going on in the brain, or just like, this feels really good, I'm an expert in this area, whatever. And there's a sort of an element of hyperfocus, which can be a part of ADHD for a kid or for an adult, where you just really have a really strong interest in a single thing. So yes, you can be really successful with ADHD. It may be that it holds you back a little bit. You imagine you could have done better. Whether you could have done better or not, you never know, obviously, because you don't get that look. And it might have been that something would have interfered whether you had ADHD or not. So successful enough, good enough, whatever is a good measurement for a lot of people. If the sports, I'm getting the impression that the sports are impinging upon connection or family time or something like that from the fact that that was asked. If that's the case, the thing to focus on is not, you should watch less sports, which is directive. And it's you're saying you should do something. That's one of those shoulds that you should look for. I just use should. But rather focus on the thing that you would like, what your own feelings are. I really miss you, as an example. I would love to spend more time with you. I really enjoy you. And how can we spend more time together? The positive approach is much more effective.
Thanks, and we'll probably just squeeze in just take 2 more questions, one from Trisha and one from Terry. Let Terry have the last question tonight. So, does Trisha have another question before we wrap up for the evening?
Yeah, there's a question. It says, because kids with ADHD mature slower than others emotionally, does it make it harder for them to form relationships with people, particularly in their teens? And how can you improve this if it's affecting one's life?
The answer is yes, it can, very much so. Not only because they're less mature, and so they do things that are surprising to their peers as well as to their parents, but also people with ADHD can have less ability to read the emotional cues of other people. I'm not sure why this happens, only the research suggests that this is the case. So if you're a teenager and there's all sorts of emoting going on, you may or may not pick it up. as readily as the other kids do. And so you may be kind of out of sync with what the other kids would consider to be appropriate behavior. Or you might be really hyperactive in a situation where maybe that's not as appropriate or what your peers are looking for. The kid who pokes and prods and sort of goes after, those kinds of things can irritate friends. It's important that kids have a few friends at least that they're really connected to. And you can encourage your kid to really have solid friendships with a few kids being as important as being part of the large. I mean, teenagers in general are very concerned about how they fit into the peer groups in general, and that's hard to control, but you can encourage fewer, stronger friendships perhaps. There was a second half to that question, which I have now forgotten. Did I answer it all, Tricia, or is there something else that I missed?
Well, it just said if it was like, how do you improve? Like, if it's a case that it's the difficulty in forming friendships, like how can you?
So there's actually, okay, now let me think of the book here. Why am I left out, or something like that. You can actually do social skills training, and that can be very useful for kids with ADHD if the kid is willing to do that. And that there's a book on why doesn't anybody listen to me, or something like that, which is about that, what parents can do to help with the social skills training for their kids. So that's one kind of specific program. And then there's just sort of conversations. I used to have conversations with both my kids, just because I sort of think this way, around like, well, so what do you think the motivator was for that person to bully you, or whatever it was, and talk about about kids interacting with kids and their opinions about it, and try to get them thinking about that a little bit more.
There's somebody actually has come up and saying, why won't anyone play with me? Has been the name of the book.
Yeah, and that kid might, an older teen, the book might be based for parents of younger kids, but that is the book. Thank you.
Okay.
And it's got what the book is about is it's a parent coach model that parents can use to help their kids fit in better.
Okay, thanks very much. And just for the very last question, as it was all Terry's idea, we'll go to Terry then for the last question.
All right, so this is just from an anonymous attendee. So my son is doing his leaving cert. He was diagnosed last year, and I think that I am going through a grieving stage myself, that he wasn't diagnosed earlier, and for all he has been through, it's been a tough year. So not a question so much as just a statement, I think, really. Yeah,
well, I think you allow that, you allow that grieving to happen. Don't deny it. When you find out about ADHD later than you would like to have found out about it, it often is a reason to grieve. I know we found out about my husband's ADHD well after we had been married and had kids. And one of the things that I grieved was that because we had so many years of struggle and undiagnosed ADHD stomping around in our relationship, that I didn't have as much fun raising my kids as I would have liked to have had. And I don't know if that's part of this mother's grief or not, but you can't change that. It is just what happened. You can come to terms with it, and you can take what your current today looks like and what you do in the future and have a different experience, engage with them in different ways, celebrate their strengths, look past some of the things that they still do that still bug you, those kinds of things. So that grief is real and you shouldn't deny it. But also I hope that there will be a path into some really positive interactions and better understanding. One of the things that's a real problem is understanding or misinterpreting ADHD symptoms. So once you know about the ADHD, you can interpret it much more accurately, and you can understand that your child's anger maybe wasn't so much about you, but about their emotional dysregulation, as one example. Okay. And by the way, thank you for finding me, Terry.
My pleasure.
Thanks very much for that. just first, we're not saying to apologise. I mean, we would love to go through everybody's questions, but we'd probably be here till midnight otherwise. And just we did say it was going to be 8:30, so we just tried to stick to our words on that. Just want to thank Melissa for the presentation. Just to remind everybody, we will be sending the recording and the slideshow out afterwards. There was a lot of hints and tips in there, the stuff you can take home and use in the morning. And in terms of what Melissa was saying there at the very end, in terms of talking about ADHD in our own relationship, Melissa will be back on the 24th of June, 7 o'clock for ADHD and couples. That's up on our event page now, and you can book in for that. So we look forward to seeing you all again. So thank you very much for coming along. We appreciate your time, and we hope you all found it very useful.
That was great. Thanks, Melissa.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you very much. And bye, everybody. And hopefully we'll see you on the 24th of June.
June.